Hello, this is Mrs. Taylor, and I'm going to answer the question, how do you determine domain and range? And the thing you have to remember with domain and range is what direction you are looking to determine one or the other. So domain is left to right, range is bottom to top. So keep that in mind with any graph you're given. So looking at this graph, this is looks like our parent function here is f of x equals x squared, or quadratic. And if we're going to determine the domain first, we need to look left to right. So look for the leftmost point and the rightmost point of your graph. Now with this graph, my leftmost point, my rightmost point, they have arrows. So what that means is we are to assume that that graph's going to continue infinitely in that direction. It's not going to change direction. It's just going to continue for this particular graph traveling upward. So what that tells us is that there's going to be no end to the left and no end to the right. So the domain for this graph is all real numbers. But we don't really use that in Algebra 2. We use either interval notation or inequalities. So in interval notation, instead of saying all real numbers, we say it travels from negative infinity to infinity, because infinitely to the left would be considered negative infinity, infinitely to the right would be positive infinity. So with interval notation, it would look like this. And this would read as negative infinity to infinity. If I was going to use inequalities, I would use my infinities again, but I would use my less than symbols. And so it would be negative infinity is less than x, which is less than infinity. And so some things to keep in mind if you're going to use inequalities is if you write it from least to greatest, left to right for domain, you always use less than symbols. If it's domain, your variable is always x. And one thing to keep in mind is infinity is not an actual number. So you don't ever use equal to with infinity. And the same thing goes for your interval notation. Infinity is never included because it's not an actual number. So you never use brackets with infinity in interval notation. You only use parentheses. So these two types of notation communicate the same thing, and you can use either in our class. Now to find range, you're looking from bottom to top. And if I look at our graph, the bottommost point is right here at the origin, and then the top, well, it has arrows, so it's going to continue growing infinitely upward. So there's really no bound on the top side of things, so that would be considered positive infinity because it's moving upward. And so in interval notation, I would say it travels from 0 to infinity, and because there's no open circle at 0, that means 0 is included. So instead of using parentheses, I would use a bracket on the 0 side. So it would look like this. And this communicates that my range is from 0 to infinity, and 0 is included in that range. And then my inequality would be pretty much the same two values, but with a y. So it would look like this. And because 0 is included, there's no open circle there, I would have an equal to in my inequality for the range. So it would be 0 is less than or equal to y, which is less than infinity. And so that would be my domain and range for this graph. Now what about if we don't have arrows? What do we do in that case? And so in this graph, what I have is, it looks like an absolute value graph. That would be my parent function, but instead of arrows, I have these open circles, which means the graph's going to travel all the way to there, but it's not including that y value. And so I would need to communicate that using parentheses or just less than symbols instead of using equal to or brackets. And so if we're going to find our domain first, that's left to right. So looking at our graph, the leftmost point is this open circle here, and that would be at x equals -3. And then our rightmost point is here, and that is 1, 2, 3, x equals 4. So from left to right, my graph travels from -3 to 4, but it doesn't include -3 and 4. So my interval notation would be parentheses for both sides. And so it would look like this. And it looks like coordinates for a point, but because it's coupled with the label of domain, we understand it to be an interval. And then for my inequality, same numbers, just use inequality symbols. And because the -3 and 4 have open circles, I don't use an equal to on my inequality, just less than. So now to range, which is bottom to top. And my bottommost point of this graph sits here at the origin. It's a closed circle, so that means it would be included, and that's at y equals 0. So in my interval notation, the 0 gets a bracket. And then my topmost point, well, they're sitting here together, and both of them are open. So that means that my topmost y value, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, would not be included. It would get parentheses. And just as a side note, if one of these was closed, then that y value would still be included, because even though it's open here, it's closed here, so it's still part of the range. But in this case, they're both open, so that would be a closed circle. And so my range would be from 0 to 5. And I need to make sure that my 0 has the bracket because there's a closed circle there, and the 5 has parentheses because both points at that y value are open. And so my inequality would look like this. 0 is less than or equal to y, which is less than 5. And again, just a reminder, I accept either type of notation. If you want to do just interval notation, that's fine. If you like the inequalities, that's fine too. Just make sure that you pick one and you get really good at that one method, so when you're doing a test or quiz, you're really comfortable working with that particular notation. And so that's how you would determine the domain and range of a graph.